In the middle of the night, anti-ship missiles, jet-powered aerial drones, and unmanned sea drones converged simultaneously on what Russia had spent the last 3 years building up as its final, supposedly secure naval sanctuary on the entire Black Sea coast. By morning, 4 Russian warships sat damaged, 3 grain terminals had been shut down entirely, and the message coming out of Kiev was about as blunt as it gets. There is no safe harbor left for the Russian fleet anywhere on the Black Sea. That strike hit the port of Novorossiysk, and it represents one of the most consequential single blows Ukraine has landed against Russia's naval power in the entire war, precisely because of what Novorossiysk was actually supposed to represent when Russia moved its fleet there in the first place. This is a story that combines 2 separate but deeply connected threads of Russian military decline, one playing out beneath the waves and along the coastline, the other unfolding in the skies over occupied territory and deep inside Russia itself. Understanding both of them together, rather than treating them as isolated headlines, gives you a genuinely clearer picture of where Russian conventional military power actually stands right now, years into a war that most analysts originally expected Moscow to win within weeks, rather than watch grind on with its own forces steadily eroding on multiple fronts simultaneously. Here's the backstory you need to understand why this specific strike matters so much. For years, Sevastopol and occupied Crimea served as the beating heart of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the historic home port where the Soviet and then Russian Navy had based its Black Sea operations for generations. But starting back in 2023, Ukrainian missile and maritime drone operations made that port progressively more dangerous, damaging warships and infrastructure repeatedly and steadily eroding Russia's ability to operate freely anywhere near Crimea's coastline. Facing that mounting pressure, Russia made the deliberate decision to relocate the bulk of its remaining Black Sea naval assets eastward to Novorossiysk and other mainland Russian ports, specifically calculating that the added distance would finally put the fleet beyond the practical range of Ukraine's weapons. That redirection wasn't a minor logistical adjustment. It represented Russia effectively conceding an entire historically vital naval base to Ukrainian pressure, retreating to what officials clearly believed was a genuinely safer, more defensible position, further from the front lines of this war. That retreat itself is worth pausing on, because it represented a genuinely significant concession for a military that entered this war with sweeping ambitions across every domain, land, air, and sea alike. Sevastopol wasn't just a convenient port. It carried enormous symbolic and historical weight as the traditional home of Russia's Black Sea naval power, dating back well over 2 centuries. Abandoning it as the fleet's primary operating base, even under the guise of a purely tactical relocation, amounted to a tacit admission that Ukraine, a country with no traditional navy of its own to speak of at the start of this war, had successfully denied Russia the ability to safely use one of its own most historically significant military installations. Stick around, because we're going to walk through exactly what happened during this specific strike on Novorossiysk, the remarkable secret underwater drone program that's been quietly sinking Russian submarines for months now, why Russia's Air Force has simultaneously been suffering losses that go well beyond anything happening at sea, and what this entire combination of setbacks actually tells us about the state of Russian military power heading into this stage of the war. If you're finding this kind of detailed breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a like. It helps get this kind of analysis in front of more people trying to understand the real mechanics behind this conflict instead of just the headline version. And subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a lot more of this story worth understanding. Let's talk about exactly what got hit during that nighttime blitz on Novorossiysk, because the specific targets tell you everything about how carefully this operation was planned. Ukrainian forces damaged 2 Project 11356R Admiral Grigorovich-class frigates, the Admiral Essen and the Admiral Makarov, along with a patrol ship called the Vasily Baikov. Here's why those 2 frigates specifically matter so much. Since the sinking of the cruiser Moskva back in April of 2022, the Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov had become the single most capable surface combatants remaining anywhere in Russia's entire Black Sea fleet. Satellite imagery released in the aftermath showed their forward missile banks crippled by the strikes, with visible fire damage, rendering both vessels combat ineffective. Both ships carried Caliber cruise missiles, the same weapons Russia has used repeatedly throughout this war to strike targets deep inside Ukraine, which means every hour those 2 frigates spend sitting damaged in port is an hour Russia loses part of its ability to launch exactly that kind of long-range strike against Ukrainian cities. It's worth pausing on just how thin Russia's remaining surface fleet actually is at this point in the war, because losing even 2 vessels out of an already shrinking pool represents a proportionally much larger blow than the same loss would have meant back in 2022. With the Moskva already sunk and years of accumulated damage across the rest of the fleet, the Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov weren't simply 2 ships among many. They represented a significant fraction of whatever meaningful long-range strike capability Russia's Black Sea fleet still retained after everything that's happened since the war began. Damaging both of them in a single coordinated operation doesn't just remove two vessels from the board temporarily. It meaningfully constrains Russia's entire remaining naval strike capacity in this theater for as long as repairs take, assuming the damage can even be repaired at all, given how difficult sourcing replacement parts has become under years of sustained sanctions pressure. President Zelensky personally described the operation as unique, and he was remarkably direct about the underlying strategic message Ukraine wanted this strike to send. The point wasn't simply to damage a handful of ships in a single overnight raid. It was to demonstrate, concretely and unmistakably, that Russian naval forces and the infrastructure supporting them remain vulnerable no matter where Moscow tries to relocate them, as long as the broader invasion of Ukraine continues. That's a genuinely significant strategic statement because it directly undermines the entire logic behind Russia's original decision to retreat to Novorossiysk in the first place. If distance from the front line no longer guarantees safety, Russian naval planners are left with an increasingly narrow set of options for where they can actually base their remaining fleet with any real confidence. There's also a broader economic dimension to this strike that's worth understanding, because Novorossiysk isn't purely a military installation. It functions as one of Russia's most important commercial and energy export ports as well, handling substantial cargo traffic, including Russian crude oil and refined petroleum products alongside all of its military activity. Shutting down 3 separate grain terminals as part of this same operation extends the impact of this strike well beyond just the damaged warships themselves, creating genuine disruption to commercial shipping and export logistics that ripples outward into Russia's broader economy. A sustained, credible threat to a port this significant creates pressure that goes considerably further than the immediate military targets, threatening the perception that Russia's rear areas, far from the actual front lines of this war, are genuinely secure from Ukrainian reach. That perception of rear area security mattered enormously to Russian military planning, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Militaries generally need at least some genuinely secure locations, places to repair damaged vessels, resupply, plan operations, and rotate personnel without worrying about being struck at any moment. Sevastopol used to serve that function for Russia's Black Sea fleet. Novorossiysk was supposed to be the replacement. This strike represents a serious challenge to whether Russia actually has anywhere left along its Black Sea coastline that still meets that basic threshold of security, and that's an enormously consequential problem for sustaining any kind of coherent long-term naval strategy in this theater. Now, this specific strike didn't happen in isolation. It's actually part of a much longer, more sustained pattern of Ukrainian naval operations against Russia's Black Sea fleet, one that includes a genuinely remarkable secret weapons program worth understanding in detail. Back in December of last year, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, announced it had used a previously unreported underwater drone called Subsea Baby to strike a Russian Kilo-class submarine directly inside the port of Novorossiysk. According to the SBU's own statement, the submarine suffered critical damage and was effectively put out of action entirely. If confirmed, that attack marked the very first successful use of this specific underwater drone against a Russian submarine, and it represented a genuinely significant escalation in the kind of naval warfare capability Ukraine had managed to develop, entirely without a traditional navy of its own to speak of. The naming of that drone itself is worth a moment's attention, because it tells you something about how Ukraine has approached this entire unmanned weapons program strategically. Subsea Baby is clearly derived from the same naming convention as Ukraine's earlier Sea Baby surface drone, the unmanned vessel that's already been responsible for driving Russian ships and submarines out of Sevastopol Bay through a sustained campaign of surface strikes throughout Crimea. Extending that same basic platform concept underwater into a domain where Russia's Kilo-class submarines were specifically designed to operate with near-total acoustic stealth represents exactly the kind of technological leapfrogging that's characterized so much of Ukraine's approach to this war, adapting cheap, mass-producible unmanned systems to systematically counter increasingly specific and increasingly expensive categories of Russian military hardware. Let's talk about why that specific class of submarine mattered so much as a target, and why its loss represented such a meaningful setback for Russian naval planners specifically operating in this theater. Kilo-class submarines, sometimes called improved Kilo variants, earned the nickname Black Hole from NATO specifically because of their hull design's remarkable ability to absorb sound and remain essentially inaudible to sonar detection, making them some of the quietest non-nuclear submarines anywhere in the world. Each one is capable of launching caliber cruise missiles, some variants even nuclear capable, giving Russia a genuinely stealthy, hard-to-detect platform for striking targets far beyond the immediate battlefield. The SBU estimated the cost of the specific submarine damaged in that December strike at somewhere between $400 and $500 million, accounting for the added expense of replacing components that are now considerably harder to source given the extensive sanctions regime already in place against Russia's defense industry. Losing or severely damaging a single vessel this expensive and this strategically significant, using what amounts to a relatively cheap, unmanned underwater drone, represents an extraordinarily favorable cost exchange for Ukraine. Exactly the kind of asymmetric advantage that's defined so much of how this smaller, more resource-constrained country has managed to inflict such disproportionate damage on a much larger conventional military throughout this entire war. That cost asymmetry is genuinely worth dwelling on for a moment because it reflects a broader pattern that's shown up again and again throughout this entire conflict, well beyond just this one specific submarine. A country without the industrial base to build and field a conventional navy capable of directly challenging Russia's Black Sea fleet in open combat has instead built an entire ecosystem of relatively inexpensive, mass-producible unmanned systems, surface drones, aerial drones, and now underwater drones, specifically engineered to exploit the enormous cost differential between what Ukraine spends building each individual weapon and what Russia loses every time one of those weapons actually connects with its intended target. That approach has proven remarkably effective at steadily grinding down an adversary that entered this war with an overwhelming conventional naval advantage on paper. That December strike wasn't an isolated incident either. Russia's Black Sea submarine fleet has been absorbing losses and near losses across an extended stretch of this conflict, and walking through that broader pattern helps put the Novorossiysk strike into proper context. The submarine Rostov-on-Don, part of Russia's original 4th Independent Submarine Brigade, was severely damaged back in September of 2023 after being struck by a Storm Shadow cruise missile fired from a Ukrainian fighter bomber. And it was believed to have been finished off entirely in a follow-up strike roughly a year later, in August of 2024, using a combination of unmanned systems and American-supplied ATAC-MS missiles. British military intelligence at the time assessed that while the loss wouldn't dramatically alter Russia's overall maritime strike capability on its own, it would likely force Russian naval planners to fundamentally reconsider how and where they deployed their remaining submarines in Crimea going forward, a warning that appears to have proven entirely correct given everything that's happened since. That original brigade started the war with 6, Project 636, 3 submarines in total, and it's worth tracking what happened to the rest of them to appreciate the full scope of the attrition involved. 3 of the 6 were caught outside the Black Sea entirely when the full-scale invasion began, 2 stranded in the Mediterranean and 1 in the Baltic, permanently unable to return to their intended operating area for the remainder of the war. That left only 3 submarines actually available inside the Black Sea itself to face everything Ukraine would eventually throw at them over the following years, a fleet already cut in half before a single shot had even been fired specifically at any of the remaining vessels. Another submarine from that same original brigade, the Novorossiysk, experienced its own separate ordeal entirely unrelated to direct combat damage, one that ended up embarrassing Russian naval prestige almost as much as any missile strike could have. Back in September of last year, reports emerged that this specific Kilo-class boat had run into serious technical problems while operating off Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, with fuel reportedly leaking into the bilge at the very bottom of the vessel's hull, creating a genuine risk of explosion. The submarine was ultimately forced to surface, giving away its exact position, and had to transit back through the English Channel on the surface, escorted by a Russian Navy tug, while a Royal Navy frigate and Dutch naval vessels shadowed its entire journey home. That's a genuinely embarrassing sequence of events for a vessel that's supposed to represent one of the stealthiest, most difficult to detect assets in Russia's entire naval arsenal, forced instead to travel home on the surface in full view of NATO warships, specifically because of a mechanical failure that had nothing to do with enemy action at all. Taken together, these incidents paint a genuinely revealing picture of a submarine fleet under enormous compounding strain, facing threats from Ukrainian strikes, mechanical breakdowns, and the simple, grinding difficulty of maintaining sophisticated naval hardware during a prolonged war that's placed Russia's broader defense industrial base under sustained sanctions pressure for years now. It's also worth being clear-eyed about an important distinction here, because it would be misleading to suggest Russia's entire submarine force is collapsing across the board. Analysts studying Russia's broader naval posture have specifically noted that while Russia's surface navy has been humiliated throughout this war, its submarine force overall, particularly its more advanced Yasen-class vessels equipped with hypersonic weapons and even the reportedly nuclear-powered Poseidon doomsday torpedo system, remains the one part of Russia's naval arsenal that genuinely still worries NATO planners. That force, primarily concentrated in Russia's northern and Pacific fleets, rather than the Black Sea specifically, represents a fundamentally different and considerably more capable category of threat than the older, more vulnerable Kilo-class boats that have taken such consistent punishment in the Black Sea theater specifically. Now let's shift over to what's been happening with Russia's Air Force, because this is where the humiliation described in the story's title becomes genuinely apparent. And it's a pattern that's been building for years, rather than emerging suddenly. Just days ago, open-source intelligence analysts identified satellite imagery indicating a Ukrainian strike had damaged a Su-34 fighter bomber at Russia's Akhtubinsk airbase, located in the Astrakhan region. That specific location matters enormously, because Akhtubinsk isn't just any airbase. It houses the 929th State Flight Test Center, known by its Russian acronym GLITS, which functions as the Russian Air Force's principal facility for testing new aircraft and weapon systems before they ever reach frontline combat units. Striking a facility this significant, one specifically dedicated to the kind of advanced testing and development work that's supposed to happen well away from any active combat zone, sends its own pointed message about just how far Ukrainian strike capability can now actually reach into Russian territory. Think about what it actually means, strategically, for a strike to reach a facility like this one specifically. Flight test centers exist precisely because militaries need somewhere genuinely safe and secure to evaluate new equipment before committing it to actual combat operations, free from the immediate pressures and risks of an active war zone. A successful strike against exactly that kind of rear area testing facility suggests Ukraine's long-range strike capability has matured to the point where essentially nowhere inside Russian territory can be treated as fully secure anymore. A genuinely significant shift from the earlier years of this war when Ukrainian strikes were largely confined to occupied territory or targets relatively close to the immediate front line. That single strike fits into a much larger, longer-running pattern of Russian tactical aviation losses that's been accumulating steadily since the earliest days of this war. Independent tracking organizations compiling visually confirmed aircraft losses put the total number of Russian fixed-wing aircraft destroyed throughout this entire conflict at well over 350, including dozens of aircraft drawn from Russia's genuinely modern frontline fleet, rather than older Soviet-era platforms being phased out anyway. Specifically, Russia has lost roughly 20 Su-30SM multi-role fighters, more than 40 Su-34 fighter bombers, 8 of its advanced Su-35S air superiority fighters, at least 1 Su-57 stealth fighter, and several MiG-31 interceptors, a combined total representing a genuinely significant chunk of the country's most capable, most modern combat aircraft. That Su-34 loss rate specifically deserves closer attention, because it reveals something important about a genuine technological vulnerability that Ukraine managed to exploit systematically over time. Back in September of 2022, a Russian Su-30SM was shot down near the town of Izium in the Kharkiv region, and an inspection of the wreckage afterward revealed a relatively intact electronic warfare jamming pod known as the SAP-518SM. Ukrainian and Western intelligence services were reportedly able to extract enough technical information from that captured pod to develop effective countermeasures, feeding what they learned directly into the targeting systems used by American-made Patriot missile batteries deployed across Ukraine. That single piece of captured hardware effectively handed Ukraine the technical blueprint needed to defeat the exact electronic jamming system Russia had been relying on to protect its most advanced tactical aircraft. And the results have shown up consistently in subsequent shootdowns ever since, with multiple confirmed incidents of Su-34s and Su-30s being intercepted by Patriot systems, despite carrying exactly the kind of electronic warfare protection that was originally supposed to prevent exactly this outcome. That's a genuinely remarkable technical story worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates how a single early war mistake, in this case, failing to fully destroy sensitive electronic warfare equipment before it could be recovered and studied by the opposing side, can produce compounding consequences that continue playing out years later. Modern electronic warfare systems depend heavily on maintaining secrecy around exactly how they detect and jam incoming threats. Once an adversary has physical access to study that system in detail, reverse engineering effective countermeasures becomes a matter of careful engineering work rather than genuine mystery. And that work, once completed, doesn't need to be redone for every subsequent aircraft carrying the same or similar jamming technology. Every Su-34 or Su-30 that's continued flying combat missions with the SAP-518SM or closely related systems has effectively been carrying a known exploitable vulnerability into contested airspace ever since that original piece of wreckage was recovered and studied back in 2022. Think about what that specific vulnerability actually represents strategically, because it's a genuinely elegant example of how a single piece of battlefield intelligence can produce outsized compounding returns over an extended period. One captured jamming pod, recovered from a single downed aircraft early in the war, appears to have contributed directly to a systematics vulnerability that's continued costing Russia advanced aircraft years later, well into 2026. That's exactly the kind of asymmetric intelligence advantage that a technologically sophisticated but materially outmatched defender can leverage far beyond what the raw numbers of aircraft or missiles on either side might otherwise suggest. And it helps explain why Russia's Air Force has continued suffering losses among its most advanced platforms, even as the war has dragged on for years, and Russian industry has had ample time to theoretically adapt and improve. It's worth being fair and balanced about this pattern too, because Russia has certainly continued producing and fielding new aircraft to replace at least some of these losses over the course of the war. But replacing an aircraft isn't the same thing as replacing the accumulated combat experience of the pilots and crews lost alongside it, and it's genuinely difficult to fully offset the kind of steady, years-long attrition that's been documented against Russia's most capable frontline squadrons specifically. Every Su-34 or Su-30 lost to exactly this kind of engineering vulnerability represents not just a single expensive piece of hardware, but also trained aircrew, accumulated unit experience, and a slow, cumulative erosion of the kind of advanced tactical aviation capability that's supposed to give Russia a meaningful qualitative edge over Ukraine's comparatively smaller and older air force. That contrast between Russia's original overwhelming numerical and technological advantage at the start of this war and the actual outcomes several years later is worth sitting with directly. Ukraine entered this full-scale invasion with somewhere around 120 to 130 operational fighter and ground attack aircraft, many of them aging Soviet-era platforms, considerably less advanced than what Russia was fielding. On paper, that disparity looked overwhelming in Russia's favor. 4 years into sustained fighting, that headline imbalance has proven genuinely misleading. Ukraine has lost a meaningful number of aircraft of its own throughout this war, but Russia's own losses from its considerably more modern, more expensive core fleet have been severe enough that attrition has steadily eroded whatever qualitative edge Russia's Air Force originally possessed, even as Moscow has continued delivering new-build fighters to at least partially offset the numbers. Let's bring this all together, because the combination of what's been happening at sea and what's been happening in the air paints a genuinely coherent picture of where Russian military capability actually stands right now, several years into this war. Russia's surface navy in the Black Sea has been forced into a series of retreats, first abandoning its historic home port at Sevastopol, then watching its supposedly safer replacement at Novorossiysk get struck directly, damaging its two most capable remaining frigates in a single coordinated operation. Its submarine fleet, at least the older Kilo-class vessels operating specifically in the Black Sea, has absorbed losses to a previously unproven underwater drone technology, alongside embarrassing mechanical failures that have nothing to do with enemy action at all. And its Air Force, despite entering this war with an enormous numerical and technological advantage over Ukraine's aging fleet, has hemorrhaged dozens of its most advanced tactical aircraft to a documented electronic warfare vulnerability that Ukraine identified and exploited systematically over years, rather than through any single decisive breakthrough. None of that means Russia's broader military has been rendered ineffective, and it would be a mistake to overstate the significance of any single strike or any single category of losses in isolation. Russia continues launching sustained missile and drone barrages against Ukrainian cities, continues grinding forward incrementally along various sections of the front line, and retains, particularly through its more advanced submarine forces, based outside the Black Sea specifically, genuine strategic capabilities that continue to worry NATO planners. But the specific pattern documented across both the naval and air domains throughout this conflict tells a genuinely consistent story about a military that entered this war with significant structural advantages and has watched those advantages erode steadily, engagement by engagement, through a combination of Ukrainian technical ingenuity, captured intelligence turned into systematic countermeasures, and asymmetric weapons like underwater drones that cost a tiny fraction of what they've managed to destroy or disable. It's also worth understanding what Ukraine has actually tried to do with the leverage generated by strikes like the one on Novorossiysk, because the aftermath reveals something important about how military pressure and diplomacy have continued interacting throughout this conflict. Following that specific strike, Ukraine offered Russia a Black Sea maritime ceasefire, an offer to formally de-escalate naval hostilities in that specific theater, even while the broader land war continues elsewhere. That timing wasn't coincidental. Offering a ceasefire immediately after demonstrating decisive naval superiority puts Ukraine in a considerably stronger negotiating position than it would have occupied making the same offer from a position of weakness, essentially inviting Russia to formalize an arrangement that already reflects the reality Ukraine has established through force. Whether Russia actually engages seriously with that specific offer, or whether it simply continues absorbing losses while trying to find some way to reassert control over its own coastline, remains one of the more interesting open questions hanging over this specific theater of the broader war right now, There's a broader diplomatic logic behind that kind of offer worth spelling out clearly, because it reflects a pattern that's shown up in negotiations throughout military history whenever one side has established clear tactical superiority in a specific, geographically contained theater. Proposing a ceasefire from a position of demonstrated strength costs the proposing side very little, since it can continue applying pressure if the offer gets rejected, while potentially locking in a favorable outcome if the other side accepts. For Russia, accepting a Black Sea-specific ceasefire would mean formally acknowledging, at least implicitly, that it can no longer guarantee the safety of its own naval assets anywhere along that coastline. A genuinely difficult admission for a government that's spent years insisting its military position remains fundamentally sound, despite everything that's happened. Rejecting the offer, on the other hand, means continuing to absorb exactly the kind of losses that made the ceasefire proposal attractive to Ukraine in the first place. The combination of naval and air losses, considered together rather than as isolated headlines, ultimately illustrates something important about how modern warfare between a materially outmatched defender and a larger, conventional aggressor can actually unfold in practice. Ukraine never needed to match Russia ship for ship or jet for jet to inflict genuinely consequential compounding damage on Russia's broader military capability. It needed sustained technical ingenuity, the patience to exploit captured intelligence systematically over years, rather than expecting instant results, and a willingness to invest in exactly the kind of cheap, mass-producible unmanned systems that could convert Russia's numerical and technological advantages into liabilities over time, one damaged frigate, one destroyed submarine, and one shot-down fighter jet at a time. What do you think this combination of naval and air losses actually tells us about the trajectory of Russia's broader military capability at this stage of the war, more than 4 years after the full-scale invasion first began? Do you think these represent genuinely significant structural weaknesses that will continue compounding over time? Or do you think Russia's overall scale and industrial capacity eventually allows it to absorb and adapt to exactly this kind of sustained attrition the way larger militaries historically have in past prolonged conflicts? Let us know what you think down in the comments. We read through every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into in future videos. If this breakdown helped you understand the real mechanics behind these specific losses instead of just the headline version, do us a favor and hit like on this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next deep dive into exactly this kind of pivotal development. There's a lot more happening beneath the surface of this war than most coverage ever fully explains, and we'll keep digging into it as it continues to unfold. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.